You're dealing with an autoimmune condition, and you're tired of the flare-ups, the joint pain, the unpredictable symptoms. And you've heard that going gluten-free can help. And for some people, it can make a world of difference. And for others, not so much. So which one are you? And more importantly, if going gluten-free isn't your answer, what is?
What if gluten isn't the actual problem, but rather another compound that can go with it? There's another dietary factor that often gets overlooked, one that's also found in wheat and other common foods. The good news though is that you may not need to cut out gluten entirely, just the real culprit that's behind your symptoms.
Stay with me because by the end of this video, I want you to have a clear plan on how to figure out what works for you. Let's dive in. I'm Dr. Banasali from Plant Forward MD, a rheumatologist and culinary medicine specialist. Why do people choose to go gluten-free if they have an autoimmune disease?
If you have an autoimmune disease, you should be suspicious of gluten because there is an association with a number of different conditions. The amount of gluten sensitivity is higher when you have Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis, but also with a condition called Sjogren's syndrome, which is when you have severe dry eyes and dry mouth. But the association with gluten isn't actually that high if you have autoimmune thyroid disease, unless you not only have the thyroid disease, but you also have Sjogren's. Now, having both of them, yes, there is a higher chance of gluten sensitivity. What about autoimmune arthritis? Well, some of them are associated with gluten sensitivity, but not actually all of them.
Celiac disease is an autoimmune disease where gluten can trigger severe gut damage. And yes, when you have one autoimmune disease, you are more likely to have another. But actually, celiac disease really only affects 1% of the population, although a lot of people remain undiagnosed. The easiest way to figure it out is actually either a blood test, or a better way would be a colonoscopy. If you are 45 years old or older, just get it done. Yes, the age was lowered. It used to be 50 years old, but now it is 45 for colon cancer screening. And if you have any symptoms that could indicate celiac disease, you might as well just get it done. I'm not going to tell you it's a comfortable test because it's not, but it can help prevent colon cancer and it can give you an answer. Now, what if you don't have celiac disease? There is another entity which is kind of being more researched right now called NCGS, non-celiac gluten sensitivity. How often is it? How commonly is it found? Well, actually, the jury is still out on that. Because it's still an emerging entity, the numbers are kind of all over the place, anywhere from 6% to 13%, and it kind of depends on the region that you live in. For example, Australia is pretty high in terms of NCGS. And in that case, you're not technically allergic to gluten, but you do have a sensitivity to it, so it can cause some symptoms for you. Whether it's just gut symptoms, bloating, diarrhea, gas, or more in the joints, it can bother you. What about rheumatoid arthritis? Well, it's not actually that commonly associated with celiac disease. Yes, you could have gluten sensitivity with rheumatoid arthritis, but the research right now is showing that it's not as tight a connection as it is with another arthritis called psoriatic arthritis, where they definitely see more in terms of gluten sensitivity. That being said, there are people who feel better with rheumatoid arthritis if they give up gluten. So if you want to test it out, this is how you do it. Number one, if you're going to go gluten-free, you have to go fully gluten-free. You can't do just one meal here and one meal there. I mean, if you feel better, that's great. But if you want to see if that's what's bothering you and triggering your symptoms, then you really have to cut out everything that is full of gluten. And when we think of gluten, or at least when I think of it, I think of bread. I think of a big loaf of bread that you can no longer eat. Well, they do have gluten-free breads now. I make breads that have very low gluten or no gluten sometimes. So it is possible. But there's actually other things out there that you don't even realize. For example, soy sauce, ketchup. I mean, ketchup. Why would you think of ketchup when you're thinking of gluten? Because it has no grainy stuff in it, right? But they do put it in there. Also, some salad dressings will have gluten in them. There are easy fixes for these things. For example, instead of soy sauce, you can use tamari, organic tamari, or coconut aminos. For salad dressings, you can make your own olive oil, lemon, herbs, mix it together, and it can be pretty tasty. So there are swaps that you can do. And the second reason, one of the most important, is when people try to go gluten-free, they may switch to these other foods that say in big bold letters gluten-free, and yet they're completely full of additives and preservatives. And some of those components can trigger inflammation. So you feel like, hey, I'm eating these gluten-free crackers, but there's like this long list of 100 items in there, and your body may not react well to some of those. Focus more on natural gluten-free foods. For example, vegetables, legumes, rice, nuts, quinoa, and lean protein. And if you're going to do this, you really won't know in a week or two. You really have to give it about 4 to 6 weeks. because it can take that long for symptoms to really improve over time. Why do gluten-free diets fail? Well, the most common reason is because it isn't really gluten-free. As we said, you can find gluten in condiments, but even something like supplements will have gluten in some of them. Another reason why it could fail is that some symptoms do take longer to resolve. Usually you need about 4 to 6 weeks, but sometimes it can take a bit longer. Or the one we want to talk about is that gluten may not be your real issue. Some people react not to the gluten itself, but something else that's hiding in their diet. So don't give up hope. Let's take a look at that. Have you ever heard of Fodmaps? These are fermentable carbohydrates that some people with autoimmune conditions struggle with because they struggle to digest it. Fructans, which are a type of Fodmap, are found in wheat, onions, and garlic. Yes, this hurts my heart because I love onions and garlic. I think they're a great anti-inflammatory food, but unfortunately, some people that cannot tolerate these, it really does affect their symptoms. And you have to see if that's you. So if gluten isn't the culprit, it might help to try a low FODMAP diet to see if that helps your symptoms. Especially if you have a lot of GI symptoms like gas, bloating, diarrhea, nausea, definitely check this out. There are studies with rheumatoid arthritis and low FODMAP diets that suggest that following the low FODMAP diet could help reduce inflammation and improve symptoms. But now this is where people do it wrong because they may follow the low FODMAP diet, cut out all these fructans, but then forget about reintroduction because a lot of these foods are prebiotic foods, probiotic foods, foods that are good for you that you may not be able to tolerate at that time, or maybe you are able to tolerate some of those fructans. And if you are not eating them, you may be cutting out a lot of nutritional foods that your body really craves and needs. If it's at all possible, work with a dietitian to see how you can cut out fructans and then reintroduce them because it can be very involved. Okay, so how are we going to figure out how to go gluten-free? Number one, follow a very strict gluten-free diet. Try to aim towards more natural foods so we're not also worrying about the additives and preservatives. And if this works, great, you've got your answer. If it doesn't work, step two, try a low FODMAP diet. See if it's not just the wheat, but it's also onions, garlic, fructans that are bothering you, and see if that helps your symptoms. But don't forget about reintroduction because some of those foods may actually be beneficial and not bothering you. And then just to confuse it all, there are people with different leveling of fructans. And what I mean by that is, for example, if you eat a meal with a French onion soup that usually has a lot of caramelized onions, it can be very delicious, but it's a high onion content. And then on top of that, you have a delicious caramelized onion and leek pastry on the side. Now, this meal might be too much for you. Too much FODMAP fructans. But if you have maybe a chili, now even in chili, beans have fructans, but it's different amounts. Like for example, if you do lentils, especially if they're rinsed lentils, like the canned lentils have more fructans in them, but the rinsed ones have a little bit less. So if you made a chili and had some lentils in there, maybe even some onions, you might be able to tolerate that if it's kind of a lower volume of it. So you may not need to cut out everything, you may need to reduce it, but it's gonna kind of depend. So you're gonna have to play around a little bit. And then you try a gluten-free and you try a low FODMAP, and neither of these make a difference in your life. It may not be those foods that are causing problems for you. So then cancel it off your list, move on, and see if there's anything else that's a trigger for you. Number three, keep a journal. So this I'm a really big fan of, and if you've listened to any of my other videos, you can see how important I find it because when you have an autoimmune disease, there can be many different triggers, whether it's stress, not exercising enough, eating certain foods that just don't work well with you. You kind of need to know your triggers because it may be that you're about to go on this family vacation or a business trip, something where you really need to feel good. It's worthwhile to identify your triggers, even if you can't always follow through. Sometimes you have to go out for that donut with your friends. It happens, but at least you know what could trigger your condition and have more control over this condition because autoimmune diseases are not easy to deal with. Whatever little bit of control you can get is always a good thing. And if you want to know more about other foods that could be bothering you and should be avoided, check out this video. Gluten-free diets aren't a magic fix for everyone with autoimmune disease, but for some people it can really help. And if you've tried it and it doesn't help, there are other things that you can look at, like low FODMAP diets. Keep track of what's affecting your symptoms. Have you ever tried to go gluten-free? What happened? Was it too hard or it just didn't work for you? If you found this helpful, share with someone else that could benefit from this video. I'll see you next time for more tips on autoimmune health.